Hello there and welcome to our special coverage coming to you live on All 24 News with me, Karim Zachary. Since the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, geopolitical tensions in Europe and globally have spiked, and already contentious issues across the globe have become increasingly fraught. Deterring China while Russia remains a top priority for the West, the U.S. Army serves as a key player to joint operations in the Indo-Pacific, ready to support and enable the joint force in a future conflict scenario. Meanwhile, Russia's war in Ukraine demonstrates the importance of ground support to NATO allies and other countries. The United States and its allies have taken steps to weaken the Kremlin's ability to fund aggression in Ukraine by imposing unprecedented sanctions on Russia's financial sector and central bank. As the war continues for a fourth month and with no end in sight, there has been increased interest in targeting Russia's oil exports, which have been financing its war in Ukraine with its 20 billion monthly oil sales, an even more lucrative commodity for Russia than gas. Europe's reliance on Russia for 1/4 of its oil, however, means such a move could impose steep costs on Europe consumers and industry. All this is going to be analyzed today in our special coverage by our panel of guests. I am joined live via Skype by Greg Simons, an associate professor and political analyst from Sweden, and joining me from Italy, Giorgio Cella, a geopolitical analyst and PhD at Catholic University of Milan and NATO Defense College, also the author of Storia e Geopolitica della crisi ucraina della Rus del Kiev oggi. The book is available in Italian language and will be available in the English language by the end of this year. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. The discussion after this break. All right, let's kick it off with this info. The head of Russian diplomacy, Sergei Lavrov, denounced the West's total war against Russia during a meeting with officials of different Russian regions and affirmed that it will last for a long period of time.
The United States and its satellites are doubling, tripling, and even quadrupling their efforts to contain Russia, using a very wide range of instruments from unilateral economic sanctions to deeply misleading propaganda in the global media space. The West has announced a total war against us, against the whole Russian world. No one is hiding it. It can be said with certainty that this situation will last for a long time. The cancel culture of Russia and everything related to our country is already reaching the point of absurdity. The classics are banned: Tchaikovsky and Dostoevsky, Tolstoy and Pushkin.
So let me start with you, Professor Greg Simons. As the war rages on, it's unclear what will happen next, but high-stakes questions loom large. How might the conflict evolve on the ground at the negotiating table, according to you?
Well, I mean, the conflict has been going on long before the actual fighting began on the 24th of February. True, I mean, one can even say that its origins began already in April 2008 with the talk of bringing Ukraine and Georgia a membership action plan to NATO. So this has been something which has been ongoing. And as has been noted, I mean, this is not only about Ukraine. This has never been only about Ukraine. It's been much wider, as the intro suggested. I mean, this is concerning this the declining unipolar, US-led unipolar world and this rising multipolar world. Now, there is an attempt to keep this war going, and the United States has said on numerous occasions, Blinken and all kinds of others, such as the head of the Defense Department and so forth. What they say that this war is intended to weaken Russia's ability to exercise its influence and its expansion. So this already suggests that this needs to be a long war. I mean, it's stated already that there was, before about a month ago, that there's an Afghanistan scenario for Russia like there was for the Soviet Union. So this is something to grind Russia down. So this suggests that negotiations are going to be problematic. But if we look at the Ukrainian side, they also are constrained because they are completely dependent on the West at the moment, the US-led West, but also they're suffering significant losses in this war. So they're kind of caught in this trap as much as Russia is, even though Russia initiated the hostilities, they're both locked in it together. So, I mean, Zelensky said just recently that he's prepared to start negotiations, and this suggests that the war situation for Ukraine is at a critical point. So, having said all of these things, maybe we might start to see some move towards negotiations to cease or at least halt these current hostilities.
Thank you indeed. Dr. Giorgio Cella, how can the international community support Ukrainian refugees as the war rages on? And what can the West do more to hold Putin accountable while mitigating the risk of wider war between Russia and NATO?
Well, first off, I agree with what Professor Simon said before. This is a very old war, and that's what my book is about. It's a war that Putin has started to retain Russia as an empire. So in the future, but his mind and many of the things we are seeing today are, well, they are something that comes from the past, imperial Russian glory, idea of Russian imperialism in this part of the Black Sea. If we think about, for instance, the Novorossiya project of Catherine II, it's basically what we are seeing now with the Donbas war dynamics, which is probably going to be expanded also in the western part of Crimea up to what was once known as Bessarabia, which is Transnistria and Moldavia. I'm not saying that Russia is going to invade Moldavia, but I think that war operation might arrive close to the Transnistrian border, and probably Odessa is going to be involved as well. But of course, this is just a hypothesis for the near future. Concerning the refugees, these new global wars are multi-level. They drags on different dimensions of hostilities. You have the food crisis right now. You have the energy crisis stemming from this instability in Ukraine, this war in Ukraine, started by Russia, of course. And you also have the refugee crisis, which can be instrumentally played against Europe as well. Some observers see these as a major hybrid type of warfare. And what Europe can do about the refugees, I think that Europe is already doing a lot in terms of accepting Ukrainian refugees within the European Union. Here in Italy, for instance, we have a very large Ukrainian community that was already established here. And so the numbers are really skyrocketing right now, because we're talking about almost 10 million refugees as a product of this of only 3 months of fighting, of war. And what the West is doing concerning this immense problem is the sanctions is what the West is right now doing, but also concerning sanctions and concerning military aid to Ukraine, we have already seen some fractures within the European front, because we have what former U.S. Minister Donald Rumsfeld once said, the old Europe against the new Europe. We have, and what he meant was the old countries like Italy, France, and Germany, and Spain as well, which are having a kind of a more cautious stance towards Russia and towards arming Ukraine, while we have states like, for instance, Poland or the Baltics or Romania, which are kind of more assertive in towards the Ukrainian problem, towards sending arms, weapons to Ukraine, and they are flanked in this, of course, by the United Kingdom, by Great Britain, and by the United States, of course. The United States have clearly, openly.
Maybe we could discuss that point further a little later. Let me share with you this info. Despite the conditions formulated by Turkey following Sweden's candidacy for NATO, which required the extradition of political opponents and members of the Kurdish community exiled in Sweden, foreign ministers of Romania and Poland, presented in Istanbul, said they are optimistic about the accession of the two Scandinavian states to NATO.
Even if the government is willing to negotiate some terms, they simply cannot hand it over. Perhaps the negotiation room can take place, but not on the extradition of the critics or some other demands, because that's pretty much in the hands of the independent judiciary or other independent government agencies.
Of course, we have discussed about the enlargement, about the accession of Finland and Sweden. We are a firm supporter of the open doors policy, which brings benefits for the alliance as a whole. And we believe that the accession of these two countries will consolidate the collective defense and our security.
Very optimistic about the accession of Sweden and Finland. And certainly, given the dynamics of the political and military processes in our part of Europe, it's certainly not going to take years or months, as you were kind enough to put it. Thank you.
So let me get back to you, Professor Greg Simons. Just as the destruction of World War II opened the way to a new conception of Europe, the shock of the Russian invasion of Ukraine offers the possibility of revitalizing the European order and changing the pattern of confrontation with Russia since the end of the Cold War. But this will only be possible if US and broader allied policy is driven by a vision of Ukraine winning as the path toward a revitalized and more secure transatlantic alliance. What do you think about that? And do you think that Poland and Romania would find a way to solve the Turkish opposition to the two countries joining NATO? If so, what are your predictions concerning the resolutions?
Okay, well, the question of Swedish and Finnish accession to NATO, I mean, this was already something which had been decided some time ago. NATO has been lobbying Sweden and Finland intensively for a number of years now, and it's moved from some pretense of neutrality to some pretense of non-alignment, and it's moved into integration even before the current war in Ukraine. So the war in Ukraine is being used as a catalyst to legitimize this particular accession. Now, it's natural for Turkey to take advantage of the situation in terms of diplomatic leverage to get some things that it wants to, because if we're looking at this comprehensively, it's not about collective security by increasing the number of NATO countries, especially NATO countries that border Russia. I mean, this is increasing collective insecurity, because when the security of one is compromised at the expense of others, usually tensions get worse. I mean, and of course, wars have been used previously to bring countries such as Finland into the German alliance in 1941, after the Soviet Union invaded Finland, or attempted to invade Finland, 1939-40. So it has a precedent. Now, Turkey, I see no reason why they should not give up on trying to get something for Turkish interests. After all, they've been quite criticised by NATO recently, and this is an opportunity, and they use the moment. In terms of Poland and Romania, what they say, well, Poland and Romania have quite a, should we say, historically antagonistic relationship with Russia and its former states which have made up this. Mm-hmm. So, of course, they're going to put on a brave and diplomatic face on the camera, but they're going to have to go about this another way, because as it stands, if one country says no to the membership, then it's blocked. So in this case, Turkey, either they have to change the whole system of how NATO functions in terms of bringing in new members, or give Turkey something which it's prepared to accept in order to allow membership.
And say Finland and Sweden do join NATO, what do you think Russia is going to respond like after that?
Well, I mean, this, first of all, Finland and Sweden will both move from being subjects of international relations to objects. So, and I mean, this is clear. I mean, what's happening in Ukraine, for example, illustrates this, and especially these points which are made by Blinken and others in the US government, who are saying the main geopolitical aim is to contain Russia. And hence, we're looking at the Baltic Sea, a Russian border. So this, I mean, as the Russians have said previously, there's been a cold friendship between Finland and Sweden with Russia. But then this is going to move to something enemy status, because NATO is seen as being an enemy of Russia, which NATO openly says Russia is an enemy. So in this particular instance, I mean, the thing which would almost certainly be done is that different military objects of interest in Sweden and Finland will be added to any target list in case there is any larger confrontation with NATO. And these will be, given their geographic proximity, they'll be on the front line. It's not a smart move.
Thank you indeed. Dr. Giorgio Cella, just as the war has revealed gaps in Russian military capabilities, it has also shown that the multilateral institutions at the heart of the alliance, NATO and European Union, that is, were not built for crisis response. In your opinion, what will Europe need in the medium term and long term?
Well, the initial part of the war by the Russians was not as brilliant as many thought it would be, but now they have kind of fixed certain, they have fixed their operational ways in this war. In the Donbass, they are slowly increasing the territories under their control. This crisis has put has created hardships for multi-level organizations like the European Union and the UN in order to be an organization that have a saying in the resolution of this conflict. Moreover, let me say that before this crisis began, in the Caucasus region and in the overall broader Eurasian context, Russia was one of the main diplomatic power brokers. It enjoyed a very also international accepted status as a diplomatic power broker. Just think about the peace treaty that has been put forth by the Russian to end the last Armenian-Azerbaijan war, that has back then also been complemented by the UN General Secretary. So this war has really changed the landscape of the power, the balance of power in the region, and also the multilateral organisms as the EU and the UN need to definitely rethink some of their mechanisms, also in terms of have a voice.
And speaking of the change and the imbalance that this crisis created, let me share with you this info. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán has opposed the embargo on Russian oil, as he says it would destroy his country's economy. Hungary transports 96% of its oil from Russia through the Druzhba pipeline, and Budapest is asking for an up to 18 billion euros in aid to adapt to its infrastructure to change in oil supplier. Hungarian Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, meanwhile, says his country needs up to 4 years to shift away from Russian crude.
We can only support this shift if it does not cause unpayable costs for Hungary and the Hungarian families. Today it would. Therefore, we need funds for the shift. An interim period, this is the condition for the support. If the Commission can offer a solution for this, then we are open to back the sanctions. If not, then we ask for an opt-out.
We are upset, to say the least, to see how the sixth sanctions package by the European Union is hanging in the air, because of the veto, basically de facto veto imposed by Hungary.
Professor Greg Simon, Western leaders are divided between those who think they can work with Vladimir Putin's Russia once more the war is over, and those who think they cannot. The war is leading to disputes over the arming of Ukraine, the feasibility of enforcing a Russian oil import embargo, and whether Kiev will have to accept a further loss of territory at the end of the war as the price for peace. What do you think, Professor?
Well, I mean, we have a lot of different terms which are quite vague. Like, we have this idea, international community. The US and the EU is using that a lot, saying the international community stands with Ukraine, stands against Russia, etc. What is the international community, especially if you look at it visually? And by visually, I mean, what are the countries in the UN voting when there are issues pertaining to Ukraine? Well, if we look at international community there, it is basically the US, NATO, EU, Japan, South Korea, Singapore, those countries within this US unipolar world, this Western-centric part. And when we look at the rest, I mean, they're not so interested in this Ukrainian war, or they're neutral. For example, a great deal of pressure has been attempted against India, which has refused to condemn the war, Russia's participation in the war. So when we have this, I mean, of course you're going to have at the EU, because in spite of having this facade of a united and homogenous entity, there are still aspects of national interest, because these countries are still nations. They're not one big blob of a political entity. And so you're going to get countries like Hungary, who have always been more independent in terms of asserting their national interests and security. And so, of course, if you have this consensus-based voting, they're going to stand up for what they want and need. I mean, of course, the EU can't just cut Russian oil or gas overnight. I mean, this war and the sanctions, these are not a one-way street. These are not just Russia has already been preparing for sanctions, and it has been doing so since at least 2014. So it's somewhat guarded against this. Plus, this non-Western centric world, this, if you want, global South, are not joining the sanctions. So when you get countries like even Germany, which is under a great deal of pressure, I mean, if they cut Russian gas and oil, I mean, it's going to be a disaster for their economy. And the economies of Europe are already weakened after the coronavirus because of the, I'd say, rather risky and, corrosive policies that they applied during the coronavirus. So it's going to exacerbate the economic weakness which Europe is suffering, and this whole Western-centric world, which is in a form of decline.
Very nice.
And a lot of this is owing to its own policies.
Very nice indeed. Thank you so much. Now, let me address as a final question, Dr. Giorgio Cella. Do you think that European unity is indeed at stake, despite them claiming that Europe is united? However, it seems to be the opposite, since some European countries, such as Hungary, are against sanctions on Russia. Mr. Giorgio?
Yes, as I was hinting before, fractures and divisions within the European Union have always been there. I said about different new Europe and old Europe, and this crisis highlighted this division even further in many ways. Professor Simons was talking about the hardship of Europe to keep a straight front when it comes to sanctions and when it comes to sanction to gas as well, which is something of a really problematic issue for certain countries as well, which are highly dependent on Russian gas. Now they're trying to diversify their types of energy, but yes, this is a very, very tricky situation for the European Union as a united front, and we are seeing this also in a lighter way when it comes to NATO. At the beginning, there was a really compact front, but slightly now you had also slight differences also in the way to address this whole issue of arming Ukraine, or even in terms of declaration statements made by some European leaders in order to try to keep an open dialogue with Putin's Russia, while, for instance, the United States, with what we can call the Austin Doctrine, which was openly manifested at the Ramstein meeting of last month.
Thank you so much, Dr. Giorgio Cella. Since we're run out of time, I have to wrap up the discussion. Thank you so much, dear guests, for being with us and your thorough analysis. Thank you, dear viewers, for keeping it here on All 24 News. That's the end of our special coverage. Bye for now.